the most important thing is abuse of power. And obviously, we don't know the truth of exactly what happened yet. Everybody's still hedging around it. But I do think that when you are a very, very experienced man in a position of great influence and very well known, there is a great deal of scope for abusing that. And it does seem as though that may have happened. And I do think that that is something that's in the public interest. And I think it's worth investigating. It's not just his private life at that point, because it affects his colleagues, it affects his reputation, and it definitely affects the BBC.
Now, Huw Edwards has been named as a BBC presenter at the centre of allegations of inappropriate contact with young adults and teenagers. His name was released after days of front page stories. Now, the Met Police say there isn't scope for a criminal investigation, and Huw Edwards' wife says he's in hospital with a serious mental health episode. Now, Andrew Billen, he's a feature writer for The Times. He's written today about meeting Huw Edwards last week and says that, amongst other things, he was surprisingly gossipy.
If somebody of Hugh's status has an off the record lunch with a journalist, and he is indiscreet and he is gossipy, that speaks to me to somebody who might have a capacity for recklessness. He is a performer. He gave me a very good time. He wouldn't let me pay for either lunch. Of course, he's presenting a face, and as a professional and consummate professional presenter, he knows how to perform.
Now, that was Andrew Billen, and please do read that piece in The Times today. It's very reflective and kind of conflicted. The former BBC journalist John Sopel, who's a friend of Huw Edwards, says that the anchor is very angry and very let down by the coverage both from The Sun and the BBC. So, Flint Everett, this is an easy question to start with, really. Do you think that this is the legitimate top story of the day, or should it be something else?
I think the legitimate top story from a news perspective is always what people most want to read about. And I think this is what people most want to read about right now, because it isn't just some random bloke or an actor. It's somebody who, to many people, actively represents the BBC. He was the guy who announced the Queen's death. You know, he's not just some sort of B-lister. We all know who he is, and we all know the position that he's in the national view, really. I mean, he means a lot to a lot of people because he pops up in their living room every day. He's extremely familiar as a face, and part of his job as a newsreader is to be trusted as well. And whether that's right or wrong, that's part of the role, I think, of bringing the news to people daily. Again, it's a bit of a shame that it's become so meta, you know, the BBC investigating the BBC yet again. But I do think many people, certainly people who watch the news, are going to be very interested in this. Yeah.
Henry Mance, do you think that this is the top story today, or is it something else? Is it junior doctors going on strike? Is it Boris Johnson's WhatsApp failure? And this issue about public interest and public trust? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's the top story of the day. I have been completely alarmed by some of the extreme weather around the world. You know, Italy expected to hit 49 degrees C. The world's oceans are, you know, off Florida, the oceans are sort of a body temperature. They're that warm, and the impacts that will have on coral reefs, etc. So that would be my top story. But we are where we are. And yeah, I think it's a very sad situation for two families at least. And I hope that even if the news coverage continues, as the BBC continues its investigations, etc., that we do so with a bit more sort of respect and a bit less sort of titillation.
What about, there is a point of view which is represented by many people on social media, that the police, Henry, have said that there is no criminality here, there's no kind of case to answer, so they're kind of handing it back to the BBC. And people are saying, right, he didn't do anything criminal, leave it alone. And yet there are other people who are saying, well, hang on a second, there are allegations now within the workplace, and that points to a failure of the complaint system within the BBC. And that's not the first time we've heard about that kind of failure. So therefore, what do we do? Do we now just let the BBC get on with it? Or do you think that actually we should be monitoring this kind of stuff?
I mean, I think we wouldn't be in this situation if it were just some of the workplace potential allegations. I think we've come to this position where it's such a big story because the initial splash seemed to be so dramatic and so scandalous. I think we have to ask ourselves, are we prepared for public figures to have private lives that we don't know about? I mean, Huw Edwards may announce the Queen's death, and he does so in a sort of, or he did so in a sort of brilliantly somber way. He's got huge experience. He's a fantastic broadcaster. I think everyone can agree that. Does it take away from that role the fact that he may be having difficulties in his family life, difficulties in his private life, or maybe even have a private life that some people disagree with? I would argue that in his case, he's not holding himself out as a role model. He's holding himself out as a broadcaster, as a voice. And I think there are lots of people in those situations. We've seen legal cases where footballers have had their private lives exposed, and the courts have said, well, look, they're just footballers. They're not people who are holding themselves out as archbishops here. So I think when it comes to workplace allegations, there has to be some respect for the process, some trust for the process. And when that breaks down, then fine, people can go to the media and the media can blow it up. And as we've seen, I think in many Me Too investigations over the last couple of years, that the media is there to sort of correct organizations' internal failings. It's not clear to me that that's what happened in this case.
Flick, what do you make of what Henry just said?
Yeah, I mean, he has a point, obviously, about the footballers and so forth. But I also think the most important thing is abuse of power. And obviously, we don't know the truth of exactly what happened yet. Everybody's still hedging around it. But I do think that when you are a very, very experienced man in a position of great influence and very well known, there is a great deal of scope for abusing that. And it does seem as though that may have happened. And I do think that that is something that's in the public interest. And I think it's worth investigating. It's not just his private life at that point, because it affects his colleagues, it affects his reputation, and it definitely affects the BBC.